Hello and welcome to this Register webinar. Since the dawn of time, people have been struggling with deep and philosophical questions like, why are we here? What's it all for? What is the roadmap to the data-driven enterprise? And this is the very question that we've been assembled a fine panel of experts and industry players to understand exactly what's going on in the world. So I've got the little thing here, so I'm going to flick onto the next slide and give you some names. I'm John Collins from the Register. We've got Clive Freeman from HPE, we've got Chris Shaw from Intel, and Dale Vile from Freeform Dynamics, all of whom are going to hopefully give us some answers to some of these questions that are the most taxing of our time. And just to illustrate how taxing this question is, we're going to go right back to the beginning of this very question, which is the date 1961. So I wanted to jump straight onto that as quickly as possible, because that was the first reported use of the term information explosion. And it also happened to be just 3 months away from Dale Vile himself, who is of the same age. I'm sorry if I bring that up, Dale.
At this 55 years ago today. It's vintage. That was a good year for all sorts of things.
Yeah, so Dale actually created the information explosion. He just didn't know it. It was the butterfly floating the wings in the Brazilian rainforest. So what I thought I'd do is I'd stick that date up on the screen and get each of our panelists to introduce ourselves and say, yeah, is this the same old, this data-driven stuff, or how have you seen it evolve over the past decades it has been since we first used the term? Dale, maybe I'll start with you. You're the birthday boy, or the birthday year at least.
Well, this is this here was from New York Times. I think was the first time it was mentioned, the term information explosion. I was doing a little bit of sort of background research for this, because we started out by saying, well, okay, organizations have lots of data nowadays, and if they can harness that data and turn it into business insights and use it to drive the business, then, you know, isn't life going to be great? It'll help them survive, if you want to take the extreme view, or help them sort of win against competition. And I can't remember a time when we haven't been saying this, to be honest. I mean, I've been in IT for, 30 odd years, sadly born in 1961. And I've had this discussion in the context, I've written some of these things down, you know, old timers out there will recognise these: decision support, data mining, relational databases even. We used to sell relational databases off the back of making better use of your data. Data warehouses, OLAP. Anyone remember OLAP? Online Analytical Processing.
I'm sure some people are still doing OLAP. So.
Exactly. So when I see a lot of the things around, you know, a lot of the pitches around big data and embedded analytics and all the kind of stuff today, it all sounds vaguely familiar. So I think one of the big questions, which you know, we should be exploring as we go for the next hour, is so what's changed? So that's my view.
Over to you, Clive. Where's your data background?
My data background.
Why are you here?
Why am I here?
Yeah.
Well, why are any of us here? I'm here, I guess, because although I've not been in the industry quite as long as you, I've been in the industry nearly as long as you. So when I started doing software development pretty much 30 years ago, actually the first thing I worked on was a big database system that was looking at mapping a hierarchical database system to allow you to access it in this novel fashion that we called a relational database. And I remember at the time the biggest database anybody had ever seen was one that was for one of the big oil companies that had 10 million rows in it. I talked to a customer who came into our customer centre the other day, and they were talking about a set of data that they were tracking that was 10 million rows a second. And that's the change. So over the last 30 years we've moved from 10 million rows full stop to 10 million rows a second. And by the way, these guys were saying they're thinking in a few years it's going to be 100 million events a second.
If data was already exploding, we need a new term, don't we? It's kind of an exploding explosion.
Well, I think it's one of these. It's just a feedback effect. You know, the more data that's out there, the more data we produce about the data, and of course there's a whole bunch of other effects around that: Internet of Things, the sensor technologies, and so on that we now have that are also feeding into this information pool. And the question is really for businesses: how do they get value out of it? That's what the question is.
Chris,
so I should say actually before, back in the 90s when I worked for Sybase, in about 91, 92, we had something called the Gigabyte Database Club, and we had 10 customers worldwide who had a gigabyte size database, and that was mega. there you go.
I should say, anyone out there, feel free to share your stories of data experiences back in the decades. We'd love to hear them. If you've got any specifics, we could even mention them on air. So over to you, Chris. What's your
Yes, so
piece of the puzzle?
Chris Shaw, I'm the Director of IT for Sales and Marketing across Europe and Asia. But before then, my first part of my career in Intel was actually as a consumer of the data, going back to the early 90s, working in a sales environment. And one of the things that we would look at is the bookings, billings and backlog. It was the 3 Bs. It was simple reporting on what we had in our systems. We would look at things like inventory. That type of use case, you still had the question asked about what's useful data versus real information that you can make decisions upon. And I would say over the last couple of decades, really, I moved into IT about 20 years ago. If I went back even as recently as 2010 in IT and Intel, we were still doing much of the same type of reporting as I was doing when I first started in the organisation. But since that point, we've started looking at a wide variety of different ways in which you can analyse data and the type of data that's available, both internally and externally. We're a big consumer of external data now, as well as producing lots of data internally. And particularly for Intel, and the use case there is looking at the fact that Intel, at the end of the day, is a semiconductor manufacturer. And the manufacturing processes are very, very complicated, very, very intense. The amount of data produced there is so vast that analysing it provides us better ways of improving quality, yield, throughput, time to market. And I think as we go through today, we'll see examples of how that is playing out. But I would say, even as recently, as I say, as 6 years ago, probably the landscape hadn't changed. Yes, there was more data, but we were looking at the same things. Now we're looking at different things. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really one of the compelling points.
It's interesting that this kind of data to information to insight, it's like every generation thinks they do things for the first time. We're not going to go into detail on that one, but every generation of IT people think that they've created this concept of going from data to information to insight. And well, it was always about insight, you know. No one ever wanted data. Everyone always wanted insight.
Indeed.
So I mean, we've started to touch some of the topics that you mentioned, Clive, that now it's the Internet of Things, which is all very exciting and so on. And there's all kinds of different data. But how, Dale, you're the research guy in the room. How would you characterise the different aspects of what's been changing over the past 5 years?
Well, you can think of it as a few, as we got on this chart here, you can think of it as some sort of alternative things that are going on. It's actually a multi-dimensional set of variables when you look at it that way. How's that for a bit of analysis?
It's a multi-dimensional set of variables.
So you got internal versus external. Now, we've always used external data. We've always used credit checking, and we've always exchanged inventory information up and down the supply chain and stuff like that, right? So what's changed? Well, one of the things that's changed is we've now got these things, these mechanisms, API-driven mechanisms, so we can do that almost on a continuous basis if we want to. So interestingly, whilst we've got a lot of new stuff, we mentioned IoT, and we have to mention social media and stuff like that. We've got lots of feeds that we can take. A lot of the traditional external data we've used is now available in an electronic form, constantly being updated. And I think that's a huge difference compared to a few years ago. I think that the structured, unstructured thing is important as well. And a lot of data is coming in now that isn't necessarily predictable. And obviously things like XML and some of the other protocols allow us to unravel that and make sense of it. But still, you're dealing with a lot of text strings quite often that need to be parsed and dealt with. So it's a different kind of problem in that sense, and that's becoming more and more important. Speed of stuff, we've got slow moving versus fast moving. I hear a lot of people focus on fast moving, but we shouldn't forget that a lot of our crown jewels are fairly slow moving transaction data, master data internally, and the trick is to pull the two together. But the fast piece, it stresses your network, your storage, your server infrastructure and so on, if you're going to process it and keep up with what's going on. And I think the last thing for me is the high value versus low value. It used to be that everything that was held in our databases had a value. They were meaningful in terms of a transaction. Well, now when you've got a sensor out there sending IoT data, and it's just saying, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay, and you're waiting for the millionth message that says, actually no, I'm not okay this time, But in the meantime, you've gathered this huge amount of data. Do you store it? You've got to do something with it. It keeps hitting you. So the value per bit has just sort of plummeted over the years.
That reminds me of the Bletchley Park story. If I may, can I just throw in a quick Bletchley Park story? That one of the ways that they decrypted the German data was just the guy sitting on the coastline going, nothing to report.
Yeah.
And so they were, oh, we've got it again. No,
Yeah.
so it was the same length of string. So even the stuff, and I think that's half the problem, isn't it? That even businesses that don't know where the value is coming from, they can't just throw everything away because that may be the bit that's actually the most valuable. It's difficult to tell.
Indeed, I was going to say, and storage is very cheap now as well. So people are hoarding data. And like you say, I think getting the value from that becomes harder. You need better ways of working out how you can derive value from that data.
Well, and just handling the huge masses of data. I mean, if you're storing all those streams as they're coming in, ultimately, I think it was Donald Knuth, I think, who said the objective of computing is insight, not numbers. And that's the whole point. There you go.
Donald Knuth.
And that's the whole point. The point is to get insight out of this huge collection of data, often streaming data, and you talked about structured versus unstructured. Often it's not even digital data, it's now analog data, it's now voice, it's now video. Again, I've got dozens of CCTV feeds coming in, or tens of thousands of voice recordings of call centre calls. How can I get value out of that? How can I get another 1 or 2% on my conversion rate out of that?
But it's interesting, from the research it used to be keep all of your data because you don't know what's useful. Now it's keep all the data, everyone else's as well, keep all the social data because you don't know what's useful. So it's just created a kind of problem on top of a problem. But Chris, to you, you're the guy, so I should explain, by the way, Chris isn't here to represent Intel as kind of Intel inside. This is actually Intel outside, and it's HPE inside. Chris is here to actually provide the role of the customer and how to make the most of technology. And we were talking about this beforehand, and you said, the aspiration is to do a great deal more out of data than you're currently doing. So talk us through that.
Indeed.
Where are your kind of strategic goals?
Indeed, and to reinforce your point, my role within IT, people might think being in IT in Intel is a glorious position where you have all of the latest and greatest kit, and believe me, that's not necessarily true. I think we have many of the same challenges as everybody else. And also we have the same demands from our business users about how we can bring them value from all of this data. When I look at our landscape in particular, I look at 3 particular areas, and there's the design work that we do for our products, very intricate, long lead time work. For example, 6th gen core products were released last year. I'm sure there's people in Intel working on the 8th and even the 9th generation core. The design work is intense. There's lots of work that goes on around that. Manufacturing, absolutely key. At the end of the day, we provide a finished good that we sell to customers. And the manufacturing processes is an area where we've begun to see real benefit in this space. And then there's sales and marketing as well, in terms of looking at new markets, revenue streams, opportunities, and so forth. When we look at the graph that we're showing here right now, it was something that, through discussion with research analysts as well, I talk a lot to the corporate executive board about some of the things that they're seeing. This, I found, was a great way of encapsulating the types of things that we were looking at. I talked about the example I shared earlier around working in sales and just looking at bookings, billings, and backlog. In this area, it's talking about descriptive analytics. It's talking about what's happened. What have we got as an order? What have we shipped? Simple things like that. And indeed, that's going to be ever present. A need for that is always going to be there. It goes through various levels, and I won't go into detail about every single one, but predictive analytics is a phrase that a lot of people hear about. And it's really the insight is the important piece, because maybe in descriptive and diagnostic, you've got information, and you have to have manual intervention to determine if it means anything valuable. Whereas predictive is arguably saying there are things here that are happening, and we think this is what's going to happen next.
So, I mean, these things often a vendor will tell you, oh yeah, you want to move from descriptive to predictive. You as a user are actually thinking, we want to move from the kind of rear view to
absolutely
forward view.
Because for those 3 use cases I talked about earlier, you need to. How do you, in the manufacturing sense, how do you cut time out of the manufacturing lead time? we need a certain amount of time from the point in which a customer places an order with Intel before we can manufacture and deliver it. To be able to be as flexible as a supply chain as we can be, we want to reduce that window as much as possible. So being able to have these types of insights, and we talked about IoT as well. We're using IoT a lot in our factories to give a sense as not just, am I working, but what's the temperature? What's the gas mix that we've got in the environment? We're talking about clean rooms in these manufacturing facilities that are 1,000 times cleaner than an operating theatre in a hospital. So you've got to make sure that that's absolutely operating correctly. And if you get insight to a problem occurring, hopefully you can automate the resolution of it rather than manual intervention. Maybe that's where prescriptive analytics goes as well, because it says, what should I make happen? I think the ideal case here really is that it automates an event to happen. If it's the swap out of a particular piece of technology because it's worn out, or the gas is...
so it's just getting in advance of...
Absolutely.
I mean, Clive, from your experience, we've talked about problems, etc. We talked about opportunities. Here's manufacturing and sales and marketing. What other sectors do you, in your experience, and Dale as well maybe, do you think are facing the challenges and actually there's a real opportunity to make a difference here?
I think ultimately there is no industry that isn't going to be affected by this. You talked about manufacturing. There's a whole thing called Industry 4.0, which is about that change of manufacturing to this next generation of instrumentation everywhere. It's a massive move, comes out of Germany. A lot of work going on about standardised APIs. We'll come back to APIs later, I think. But healthcare is another great example. So we've done some work with Philips, where they're automating all their, not just their the machines that go out there, so CAT scanners and these kinds of things, which again produce a lot of data. How do you manage and use that data? But things like patient management systems. So I'm running a big hospital. I'm running a big group of hospitals in the UK, an NHS trust. How do I make sure that all the patient records are held in the right way, such that I can get additional insight? It's not just that knowing Mr. Jones is due to have his appendix taken out next week. It's knowing that actually we've noticed that of all the people who had their appendix taken out in this particular way, in this particular operating theatre, using this particular combination of gases and this particular combination of drugs, this was the outcome. So if we change that, we might get a better outcome. So this stuff is about outcomes that matter. It's about patient outcomes. It's about being used in the police force. You talked about social media now. Social media is a big thing that the police force now mine in order to understand what's going on out there. So I don't think there's an industry out there that isn't going to be potentially fundamentally changed by this. And you see it by the way in which the standard example is the way in which Uber have changed the taxi industry. I know it's a bit of a hackneyed example now. Excuse my pun on hackney there. Something like that.
See, we did that.
Yeah, very good.
Hey, here all week.
But it's true. But it's true. This stuff has the potential to disrupt all of the industries that are out there, I think, and to create new industries, to create new niches that exist between industries.
I kind of cheated there, by the way, and thank you, Chris Reynolds, for asking the question about are any particular sectors hit by any particular issues. Just wanted to get his name in there as a questioner. And Dale, are you seeing any particular challenges anywhere, particular opportunities for industries?
Well, as you know, we do a lot of research across all sorts of industries, and one of the things actually that we quite often look out for is what's the same between industries rather than what's different, because that tells you where some of the universal trends are going. And you do find that the same shapes of things come up time and time again. So lots of examples of that, and we've mentioned a couple here. Coming back to the chart that we got displayed, there's a couple of things that sort of picking up on that theme that I'd like to sort of add to. So we talked about predictive analytics, and one of the things that is coming through quite strongly is the idea of kind of moving from manual-driven and manual intervention processes to more automated, autonomous processes. Now, if you're going to do that, you absolutely have to have prescriptive analytics, because the machine, for want of a better word, but it could be a system, there's usually a bit of software somewhere doing it, that's data-driven, it's now got to decide what to do next in the event, as this event has happened. So, this is very real stuff, and you see that sort of right the way across healthcare, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, and so on. The other point I would make is just turning to the right-hand side of this chart. I mentioned earlier on data volumes are going up, but the value per bit is going down. Quite often, when you look at a bucket of bits in isolation, it doesn't really do very much for you. It's when you bring it together with other buckets of bits that it starts to come to life. So, an example might be if you I use the cliche social media example, but it's good for illustrating a principle. It applies to all kinds of things. But you can capture a social media feed, and just purely based on that, you can maybe do a little bit of sentiment analysis. What are people saying about my brand and so on? And that's kind of all right. You bring it together with your customer database. Now you can see what your customers are saying about you. Now you introduce transaction data into that, you can see what your best and most profitable customers are saying about you, and so it goes on. So the more data sets you actually add into the mix, the more insight you can get. So today it's all about bringing stuff together. Another example might be location data. Where's that vehicle at that moment in time? Well, that might be interesting to know, but if you also bring that together with weather information, traffic information, the delivery priorities, which customers are higher paying, lower paying, that you don't want to let down, you do want to let down. If you need to make some decision around that vehicle, where does it go next? It can't do everything that it was planned to do because of the weather conditions. Well, you want to make that decision based on something very real.
My mate Stu runs a fleet of trucks.
Yep.
And one of them was purported to be going through a village a bit too fast, customer complaints.
Yeah.
But they were able to say, no, actually, and it's all this joined up information that they would say, no, actually, he was actually under the speed limit all the way through that village, and then they could show that data straight to the customer. So whether the customer was just going to be irate anyway, who can say? But essentially, they were able to answer that case and get on with their lives. Yeah. So it was it can help in strange ways.
You see great examples of this in the utility industry. So one of the challenges that the utility industry faces in the UK is smart metering. So you used to have some guy would come around with a clipboard and he'd read your meter.
Yeah, when are we going to get that then? That's great.
Well, it's coming slowly. And that meant that there are 25 million households, whatever it is in the UK, times 2 meter readings a year. Okay, I've got 50 million points of data a year. That's fine, I can cope with that. Well, now smart meters go, I'm going to send back a reading every 30 minutes. So suddenly you've gone from, twice a year to twice an hour. And that's pushed up the volume of data hugely. All of the data they've got to ingest and do something with, but the question is then how do they get value? And when they did experiments with this in Ireland, they discovered that the most valuable additional piece of information that they needed was the weather. Not just the weather in general, is it a sunny day or a rainy day today, but the very localised weather, to know that in this block of houses here, where this meter is located, it rained for 30 minutes between 9 and 9:15, or it was sunny or not sunny. And especially as you see things like solar panels on houses, where the companies now have to cope with electricity coming in as well as going out, knowing very localised weather information as well as the smart meter readings as well as what's coming off the back of the solar panels and things actually turns out to give you exponentially more value than just a bunch of smart meter readings.
So where are we? We've got opportunity. You're saying, Chris, we've got lots of opportunity. Saying we've been talking about this thing for a long time. We're saying that the value per bit is dropping, however, and this whole idea of getting to insight. I guess the question is, has the world changed over the past 5 years? And it's a kind of question that you don't need to answer directly, because just do the research and people are saying, God blimey, what do we do with all this data now? And before, as you say, Dale, they were saying, yeah, it's a challenge, we'd love to get more out of that. Now it's how on earth can we take advantage of these opportunities like Uber is? And we talked about Uber in the meetings that we had before this event as an exception rather than the norm. But even the norm is saying we have more data than we know what to do with, and we would love to get value out of that, but we really can't. I think that's...
Yeah, but it's not just volumes though, and I'll just reiterate the point that so much analysis in the past, and I kind of lived this through a data warehousing phase, but also still today is done in batch. You import a big file from the outside world, you crunch numbers and you come up with a result, and that's it. That's today's view or this week's view or whatever. And now, now it's real time, and I think that's a huge change in terms of what
It is. I think it leads some thinking in, from an IT perspective in some of our internal user bases that's interesting as well. You know, there are ERP systems now that give you more real-time capabilities than the batched processing data warehouse views that you had before. And so everybody wants, well, I want it right now. I want that real-time insight into what's going on in my business. I actually think there's a balance. I think there's value still in the batch data that has a purpose, because what you're looking at, what you're analysing, only needs that. The timeliness of the data is not as important. And then there are other areas where you do need greater insight, utilising that real time. Yeah. And what I think we're seeing, what's really changed for us, and which means that this is a very real movement, is that we're employing different people with different skills. We're organising the enterprise differently to be able to provide and consume the types of data and derive insights that make a difference to the way we engineer things. So I do think it's a balancing act.
it is, and it's the old adage: just because you can doesn't mean to say you should.
Very good. Yes.
I think it's also requires. You talked about different skills there. It also requires people to have a good understanding of things like statistical concepts. Like, so what's the normal range for this value? It's true that this value seems to have dropped dramatically today compared to yesterday, but actually, if that's within the 90th centile, then once every couple of weeks you'll expect it to drop dramatically like that. That doesn't mean anything. And you have to train your executives, I guess you find this as well, I certainly do with some of my execs, to go, actually don't worry about that. That one is genuinely just a blip. If it happens tomorrow and the day after, then that might be a trend, and we do have to worry about that. But one off, you shouldn't worry about it. And that's a different kind of a mindset. People have to have a different view of the world rather than leaping upon a tiny exception and trying to read too much in it. And I think that's an interesting change that we're seeing as well.
We end up with this gap between what could be possible, but then we've got, as you say, it's not just technical skills. It's not just technical capabilities that we're lacking. It's actually skill sets, it's structures, it's processes, it's all of that stuff. But we end up with this shortfall. I mean, from the research data, how are you seeing that? Is it that people are going, nah, I don't really care about this stuff? He said, leading question, or is it desperate wishing that they could move things forward?
Well, there's a bit of a, I don't know if you find this in Intel, but I've interviewed quite a few people on this who've gone down this route of really going for it in terms of analytics, capability, big data and so on recently. And what I hear time and time again is sometimes you can get ahead of your users because your users are used to working in a particular way. And it might be a vocabulary thing. It might be that they can't cope with that statistical terminology, in which case you need to switch to more of a sort of business cause and effect type language maybe. But then you've got to trust. How much do they trust the data? And so you've got a mixture of both soft perception, political, human issues in there, plus some hard skills, plus technology, and it's trying to keep everything in sync. And sometimes what people ask for out in the business, I hear this time and time again as well, is they want to do things the old way faster or more frequently. And actually, it's then down to IT quite often to say, well, maybe we should think about this slightly differently. What if we were to do this instead? And that we hear that time and time again.
I think the example that I see that resonates mostly with what you're saying is the business units that are very operationally driven, that have always looked at certain amounts of data that they think is relevant. Their business acumen, they feel, is the thing that differentiates them from anybody else, getting the insight. And they want that same data faster in a spreadsheet, usually, and so that they can slice and dice it the way they see fit. I think one of the biggest challenges is evolving that mindset to get to the real point of what they're trying to achieve. I think it requires a certain level of business acumen that has not traditionally been associated with what has been done in this space. I think within Intel, and I've seen this within the industry research as well, there is a real shift in terms of where these skills reside in an organisation. You might have seen them historically within IT, with some people with greater business acumen. You now see them within the business as well. And certainly our learning is, and I think it's supported by the industry evidence, our learning is you need those people in the business. They understand the right questions that are being asked, so that you can really get to what they're trying to achieve, rather than only provide them a third of the way along their journey.
Yeah. Can I ask in Intel, do you have data scientists, quants, as maybe some people call them? And where do they live? Where do they report into?
We do, and it's a good question. We have some in the business and we have some in IT. And a lot of that is because of organisational dynamics, and where maybe the different organisations are on their journey on this.
Yeah.
So if I looked at marketing as an example, marketing have data science embedded within their business, because they want to look at, have our campaigns been successful? How are they working? How is it driving traffic to our websites, to our customers who are selling them products? But other groups are so unfamiliar with how to make this work. They're relying on somebody else to get them there. But I think that's also an example where even within an organisation you can be at different levels of maturity in this.
Yeah. No, we find that, I've heard a few people say it's better to maybe have implants into the business, so you're sort of putting, and then aim to get some skills transfer, and then you can step away when they're comfortable and confident.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we certainly talk with our customers about is that need to make the cultural change, and the cultural change sits both in the business as well as in IT.
Yeah.
It's a really important thing.
Just throw in a quick question there from Dr. Ben Silverstone, not Bill Silverstone. As we rely on more automatically generated data and Internet of Things, do we run the risk of losing skills of how we identify what we need? So at the same time as building skills, do we risk the losing
There's a really important thing you have to do, which is to be aware of what your automated system was built to cope with. You see this in financial trading a lot, where they build an automated system to cope with a particular domain, a rising market or a falling market, and it's very good at trading in that market maybe. But if the market switches the other way, you need to turn it off really fast, because otherwise, or it needs to know to turn itself off really fast. And then you switch back to the humans. So you can't kind of cut humans out of the loop. They still need to be
whole
there.
companies have gone bust, haven't they?
Exactly.
As the avalanche effect kicks in.
And that's one aspect of that, I think, which is that you have to know what your machine is good at doing, and keep it doing only that thing. Don't imagine that because you built because it's in the computer says yes and you must do it. Actually, if the computer's saying yes outside of its domain of trained expertise, then that's a bad thing to follow.
And we're all familiar actually with a good analogue for that, which is sat-navs. If you slavishly just follow what the sat-nav says without applying a little bit of common sense, then you can get yourself into some funny positions.
I do think we're in a fascinating period of our history where the temptation is just to follow technology and actually find that this thing up here is quite smart. We should carry on using it. It's quite a clever thing.
So on how do you deal with that? I mean, you need someone somewhere who cares about your business and is motivated to care about your business needs to keep that sort of business eye on things. They don't necessarily need to know the detail, but they need to be able to make a value judgment in the right scenarios. But I have heard some people who say, well, in some areas we can outsource that. So if and that's where I think genuine, we talk about MSPs quite a lot as almost interchangeable with cloud service providers. But I think providers who can really help with that problem as well. So that's about skills, know-how, as well as the technology and running platforms and that kind of thing are important. That's a very, very industry-specific discussion, but I'm coming across that quite a bit in terms of what can we outsource.
Well, and I think to your point of are we going to make the humans obsolete? We're not really. What we're doing is we're providing them with a better platform to work on. The fact that I've got a calculator that adds up faster and more reliably than I could ever add up just raises the base for me to add the next level of value. And one of the questions for us is how do we add the next level of value over and above what the machines can now do for us.
Standing on the shoulders of giants, one might say.
Yes, indeed.
It's just they're automated giants.
Newton, I think this is a never-ending journey, in all honesty. We're always looking to tune the use of people and their judgment for the best purposes.
Yes.
Don't occupy highly paid, highly capable people with simple decisions that they need to make. Have the right decisions and get them further along that path so that overall your execution is faster. So I think there's a nurturing of skills and the leadership that's required to highlight where that is.
Yeah.
I think that's crucial.
Well, before we go too deeply into the whether or not we're arriving at the end of the Industrial Revolution, wanted to pick up on your point, Clive, about platforms. And essentially, is there a starting point? Yeah, sure, we've got the picture up here saying mind the gap. Is there a starting point for what the thing should look like in terms of if you want to get there, start from here rather than from a place with a big hole in it?
I guess so. I think very often people will start to build a data lake, and probably the most common place to kind of put your data nowadays is a Hadoop-style data lake. And interestingly, the technology for looking at that has evolved. I think what we used to see was a matching of one-to-one between compute and storage uses, and that was kind of how Hadoop was originally conceived by in the sort of Google implementations of it. Now we've moved on. Now we kind of separate out the storage from the compute, and we do that because people want to do more than just the classic MapReduce algorithm, which was the thing that Hadoop originally did on that data. They want to put all their data in there, and then they want to do SQL queries against it. They want to run, more sophisticated map algorithms, more sophisticated graph algorithms against it. So I think starting by collecting your data in some format like that, the Hadoop file system is very flexible. It's a great place to
just get it all in one place.
Get it all in one place, or at least get it all in a half a dozen places. You're never going to get it all in one place. That would be a miracle. But get it all in a small number of places that can talk to each other, and then have a bunch of compute engines that are talking to an API layer that can access all that.
So we just flooded the data warehouse, did we? Is that?
Well, we had some flooding in our Houston manufacturing plant last week. They missed the data warehouse. It was okay.
Oh, good.
Okay.
I would provide a note of caution with this as well, though, right? And this is from personal experiences. Trying to forge ahead with creating the platforms, the architecture of the lake, before you really know what you're asking as a question, what you're trying to achieve, is a dangerous path, because it's an expensive investment from a people, maybe a hardware, software perspective. You want to be able to yield some value from maybe a smaller implementation that provides the building block for further development. So we had a number of examples within Intel that went in different directions, and certainly the ones that where we got further support for future investment, which is probably what's changed our landscape in the last 5-6 years, is where we've been able to prove a small value proposition with a small investment and grown sort of organically in that space. Then once I think the business understanding is there, I think then you can move even faster. And that a trigger for me happened even last week. I hosted an event where I had IT and marketing talking about some of the things that we're doing together. And the marketing foils had data analysis on there, which they'd never had before. So the demand now, it's like that's a default requirement that they want to be able to do that. So that's going to pull and drive us as an organisation. But as I say, the caution is too far in one direction without knowing really what you're trying to achieve will be potentially the wrong investment and cause a problem.
It's a step, isn't it? You're
Yes.
right. You have to walk before you can run. But I think you need to start with a data pond, if not a data lake, and then kind of. But you have to build it. My point, I guess, is that you have to build it in an expandable way. So providing a standard API layer, you've got a slide up there about our idle API layer that provides a typical standard API layer that can access pretty much anything behind it and present it to pretty much anything in the front. You can have structured and unstructured data and so on. You can access Hadoop file systems behind it. But you're right, start small, because what you will find is that you have to do a bunch of experimentation to find where to get the value, and then you can industrialize it, and then you can build on that. And as you say, it's often a funding question as well. So how do you get the funding for the next one?
But it can be very stimulating at the beginning. You can find fantastic elements there that really drive people's ideas.
I'm kind of curious to know whether, again, it's back to the question, what's new? What's new here? So how does this fit in with stuff that people have had for years, and where does the stuff that people have had for years fit in with this, if that makes sense?
Well, can I pick up on this discussion, because I think this is quite an important one, because I've heard quite a lot of different views on this over the last 6 months, 9 months or so, and I think starting small, it's got to be manageable, it's got to be scoped so that you can deliver, and it's got to make a difference, whatever you start with. But I've heard a lot of people say that if you just choose a project and you're out there to prove the value of a different kind of approach, the danger is that you grab whatever is going to allow you to deliver that, and that's not an investment. That's a point solution. It's a dead end in effect if it won't scale.
That's a good point.
So spoken to a guy from a big bank, very major global bank, and he basically said, well, what have we done? What we did was, when we started looking at the infrastructure, and you have to think about it as an infrastructure problem, we went back over the last 30 odd projects. And at any one moment in time, we've got 10 or 12 projects running in the analytics part of the business. So we went back over the last tranche projects, and we said, if we were to put this in place now, could we have retrospectively gone back and delivered those? And that gave you a feel for the sort of breadth and richness of different sorts of requirements that are out there in the business. So then they ended up pulling together a little cocktail of technology, which allowed them to create a platform. And they knew it wasn't going to deliver anything, but they knew that there were no blind alleys either. So, but also, I guess the other problem you have to think about is technology is just evolving so rapidly now, isn't it? So you can't expect that to be fixed however you do it.
No, indeed. I think there is more maturity now as well in terms of the sort of platform build out and scale out capabilities that are there. So I think if you were jumping on now, the opportunities are clearer, I think, ahead. I'd say even 5-6 years ago, they weren't as clear. You'd be working maybe with multiple partners to determine what's the path that's going to work for you as an organisation. So I think that's something that has changed.
Can I ask both of you, actually, because one of the things I've heard a few times from people as well when I've interviewed them is talking about technology readiness, maturity and so on. The bit that's kind of always been lagging is the control side of things, whether it be security, compliance, monitoring, tracking and so on. The provenance of data as it moves into a Hadoop environment. How do you manage who can see what? And then you've got the privacy side of things as well. If you pull this data set together with this data set and this data set, you've now got a potential privacy problem, which it may or may not break the regulations, but it may actually create a really poor perception with your customers.
It's the aggregation.
Yeah. So how have you found the technology side of things from consumer and producer, I guess? I'd be interested in your views.
It's an interesting one. I think there's been, even in the last 2 years, I'd say, the legislative changes that have affected things like privacy have caused us to think very differently about some of the things that we do. I think when you're working in a large organisation that is seen maybe as a target for some, for cyber events and so forth, it's created a certain level of paranoia. So I think we had invested as an organisation in that area, but what's shifted for IT in Intel, and it's really started last year when we started planning our investment for 2016, we've got a highest level of investment around security, around the elements that cover not just this sort of space and privacy, but all areas of our organisation through to client devices and so forth. We felt, and we do believe, we've had a very strong environment, but it's only getting harder to manage. And you have to be somewhat agile because, as I say, the legislative changes are driving you to say, actually, that use case that we've got over there isn't really allowed anymore, particularly within this territory.
Yeah.
So we have to be able to unpick that and make it work in a way in which it is compliant. So security compliance, absolutely, I think, for us, number one investment over the next 3 years at least.
And it's a problem to which big data itself often gets applied. One of the big domains for big data is actually analysing security challenges. So you look at things like automatic document classification. Here's a training set of documents. These are the ones that are confidential or contain private information. Now go sort the rest of our billion documents based on your machine learnt understanding of what that looks like. So that's one level of security, or security in a cyber attack domain where you're understanding the log data that comes out of the back of a whole bunch of things. So that's one kind. I think you were really talking about how do you make sure that you can't do bad things with the data lake,
yes,
as it were,
absolutely.
your data lake. And actually there are two sides to that. The first is, how do you make sure that people are accessing the data lake only in appropriate ways, looking at data aggregation. And there you can very often do some quite interesting things now with effectively labelling the data, so the way in which you manage the metadata when it goes in, and again automatically applied metadata very often. So that's the flag I would look at for that. The second question, and it's an interesting concern, is how do you know your data hasn't been poisoned?
Yeah.
How do you know what goes in there is actually true? Because if somebody could get in there and just flip a few bits here and there actually that might cause you to make a wrong decision. That might cause your automated machines to go, we're going to do this rather than that. And you know, the old example of the Stuxnet attack on the centrifuges, on the Iraqi centrifuges that were centrifuging uranium, was a virus deliberately introduced to attack a very particular part of a control system, so that everything showed green on the dashboard, but actually the centrifuges were spinning unstably and out of control.
Too fast, wouldn't they?
Yeah. So you've got to make sure your data lake isn't poisoned, and that's another security problem.
Yeah. Interesting.
I think, I mean, yeah, if you're an insurance company and the trouble is you can't unknow something once you know it, can you? If you're an insurance company and you find out that, I don't know, Skoda drivers are more likely to get cancer, and you've just linked your car policies with your personal health policies, what do you do? Because it's kind of in breach, but it's not in breach, but it's certainly not what was expected. That's not true, by the way.
A Reg journalist now, isn't it? Skoda drivers?
Yeah, no, it's not true. It's not true. It could be any manufacturer. No, forget it. Let's go. And I'm also interested, picking up on your point, Dale, that someone looked back at their past 30-odd projects and didn't turn into a pillar of salt. I think that's a really deep finding, that you can have a retrospective view on your IT situation without actually causing an amazing problem at the same time. But how do you work? So if this is about building a platform at the same time as doing everything really, really fast, isn't that an unsquarable circle? How do you do it? Clive?
I think
I'm
you're
looking at
back
you.
to, you're back to you need to start with something that's as open as possible in terms of the APIs you build around it. You asked a few minutes ago, what's changed, so what's different? For me, the thing that's different is there are now a bunch of standard, accepted formats and file systems. It's no longer all SQL. SQL was great, by the way, but people talk about no SQL databases, and they talk about completely unstructured data. An SQL database is not going to help you interrogate a bunch of video streams that are coming in from your CCTV cameras. So there are some standard APIs now that will help you solve those problems, and I think that's one thing that's changed. And the other thing that's changed is the analytic capability on the front end is now enormously more powerful. I mean, I've played a bit with R, for example, as an analytic engine, and R and distributed R as an analytic engine. You put up a slide there which shows our moonshot cartridges at the front end and a separate data system at the back end. That's our reference architecture now for deploying Hadoop. So it says stick a whole bunch of disks basically in a storage environment onto which you build your data pond growing to data lake, and have separate compute environment, because the separate compute environment can do R, it can do SQL queries against them, it can do graph analytics against them, because you've got an enormous amount of compute power just in a, in that case, in a 4.3U frame stuffed full of lovely Intel chips. That's a very, very powerful compute environment that can do an enormous amount of work against terabytes of data, and that's what's changed. Moore's law has just ground away at this problem.
So can we just buy one of these things and it's job done?
Well, you're going to buy one of these things, and it's a bit like buying a car, isn't it? I bought a brilliant car, and it's got all the features, and it's got anti-lock braking, and it's got that adaptive cruise control and all those things, but I don't know how to drive. So now you have to learn how to drive. Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. So now you have to work up to it, and you have to go, okay, well, what are the little things we need to try? This is just some infrastructure. This is just some tin. This doesn't solve your problem. However, you need to have something to run it on, and it's a good platform to run it on. But having done that, you need to learn how to drive, and that's about data scientists and educating your users, and it's about the culture that you build to interpret it, and that's the hard problem in many ways. The infrastructure is the easy problem.
And I want to go back to the APIs point as well, because essentially this is just a box that processes stuff, but actually it's about how you access it and how you integrate it into your other parts of your technology, and the past 30 years of whatever you've been building.
This is a nice demo of, or a nice piece of kit, because actually what you get in the moonshot environment is a bunch of different cartridges that you can split up in different ways. You can have some of them doing X and some of them doing Y, so you can run different workloads against the same data in the back end. And that kind of flexibility is again very typical. I want to run some science experiments in the corner at the same time as I'm productionizing this other set of analytics over here. So that kind of capability, you're right, it's just a box, but you need a box with those kinds of capabilities because actually that's where you're going to get to in
All that engineering, it's never just a box, is it? I feel for the hardware engineers when it's just a box with flashing lights. We've spent decades getting that right.
I love those things.
Actually, I do think we need to go back to what was the original definition of architecture in the IT world, which is it's not just about hardware and wires and how it's about the process, the standards, the models that are actually applied to it. And I think that's important because, with all due respect to any of those boxes, will come and go. You'll have a better box in a couple of years' time, and things leapfrog and so on. So where's your pivot point for this? And I remember back years and years ago, you all know my age now, but someone once said to me, data warehousing is mostly about process. It's not about data. It's about how do you keep things flowing. And that's as important now. And that's where the APIs come in, the standards, the access mechanisms. No big data system sits in isolation. It's got to be plugged in. It's got to be accessible from all the tools out there, at least in the short to medium term, that are out in the business.
And I remember doing a really big SAP implementation a few years ago where, the technology was hard and it was a struggle, but actually we could do that bit. There was a known art. The hard bit was the culture change for the organisation, was how they absorbed that. Actually, you're going to need to change your processes a bit to get most value out of this. And anyway, a whole bunch of it's now available. You don't need to buy your own box, you can get it on the cloud. A whole bunch of this stuff is now available as a service, consumable from a website through a RESTful API.
So hang on, do we get a box or do we not get a box?
You can have a box if you want.
There you go. So we've got options. I mean, Chris, are you getting a box? Are you just?
We have to explore all the avenues. So one of the things we do, for example, if you look at capabilities like this, is one of the fortunate things we have about being IT and Intel is that when we see particular use cases emerging within our industry, we can go back to the design engineers and say, I think we need to implement this type of capability within our silicon because that's where the industry is going. And so over the years, we've implemented certain technologies of that nature. And we did a lot of work with the open source vendors, looking at things like Hadoop, MapReduce. How could we optimize some of our capabilities to be able to provide the best solutions in this space, because the data's still growing and you still need that compute performance. And for us, we wanted to look at, so if we were to build out a private cloud environment, what would that look like? How would we scale it? How can we make use of compute capability around the organization? If we were to consume public cloud capability, how do we use that? How do we put those security controls in place so that we can meet the needs of legislation and so forth? So we have to look at all levels, I would say, to the point that we were just talking about. Each individual organization probably has its own needs and may not be able to scale in the same way. So the right consumption of cloud capabilities will probably work for some small to medium enterprises. I've talked to banks in the past as well and say my data is just too sensitive and I have too much regulatory control around mine that I have to create my own. What's great is that there's options now for people, whether they want to build, buy, grow in-house, public, private, hybrid.
Can I ask about one specific option? Some parts of the industry have gone crazy on hyperconverged. Does hyperconverged fit into this? You've mentioned separate processes.
Does hyperconverged fit into this? Hyperconverged is just a faster way of getting your infrastructure there, and for your kind of standard use case, used to be VDI, it works very well. So for VDI and branch-based systems, it works very well. I would say on the whole, for this kind of system, you just need a different balance of compute to storage. And I probably wouldn't look at a hyperconverged system for this. Okay. But they're a useful building block for many things in IT.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to clarify it's horses for courses, isn't it?
Yeah, very much.
And I would say we've got an HPE-sponsored webinar, it's pure coincidence, on hyperconverged infrastructure coming up very soon. So if you were interested in knowing more about that, then do tune in. And back to you, Chris. It's a point that came up earlier, which was that you can't necessarily trust the data. And I'm not going to ask you to answer this directly, but how clean is your data? I mean, quality levels of data. Yeah, sure, you can plug it all together, and then you find out that addresses are wrong, that you don't know who anyone is, and that's a major issue for many Is that an issue in manufacturing as well? Or?
It is, very much so. Manufacturing and different parts of our organisation, the most prominent example that springs to mind is actually around our customer data. There are so many different entry points within our organisation for new customer data. But invariably, I think we found something like 70% of the new customer data that comes in is data that we already have, but people haven't looked to see if that data is already there. So we're getting duplication of data that's coming in. So we have to put different controls around that, different workflows to be able to make sure that we're doing that correctly. But we've also made use of APIs with external agencies, Dun & Bradstreet type capabilities to look at those types of things to be able to do that. So we have to invest to it. You can't assume that it's going to work. You can't just trust the organisation who play that role to be able to do it to the required level. You need to be able to put some more controls around that, some definition of the workflow. And again, that I think for IT, when it's not just about the technology, a lot of the time it's about the business process. It's about architecting that so that it can support what you're trying to achieve there. And that's particularly true in the manufacturing side as well.
Going to keep you there because
Sure.
I want to spend the final 5 minutes. We've got 5 minutes left, just talking through a couple of examples of. And again, let's think about where we've come from, data everywhere, to past few years. We've seen an avalanche of an explosion of an inundation to a situation that we now have, and maybe an example from each of you. Chris, you first summarising
Sure.
on the manufacturing side. Are you seeing the benefits? Here's the question. Are you seeing the benefits in your environment of doing some of this new stuff?
Absolutely. And it's the convergence of a number of different technologies that are enabling this to happen as well. So I talked about our clean room environments earlier, very sensitive. Previously, the sensors that we would have there were not necessarily connected to anything, but we were monitoring certain things to ensure a certain level of quality. Since connectivity has become easy as well, the amount of sensors we've had has grown by an order of thousands. So we're now capturing across all of our factories per day 5 billion data points from those sensors, which previously we wouldn't have captured even say 5-6 years ago and put into a database. What we've
Just
done,
thinking of all these data points that are kind of withering and going, no.
well, you can translate that to lots of different areas, traffic light signals and things like that. The fact that you'd be able to get the information about how they're changing and provide it with sat-navs for data traffic flow and so forth. All of these types of technologies are transportable but reusable as well in different forms. So, as I say, in the manufacturing space, we've used that 5 billion data points. When we started working through the data and trying to work out how we could get insights, it would take us 4 hours to run those jobs to be able to get the insights we were looking for that would improve our yield, improve the time to market, reduce the manufacturing window. Now we can do those same analyses that took 4 hours in 30 seconds because we've invested and architected the right solutions, using the right data, the right intelligence within our human resources to be able to make that possible. So it's making a difference right now.
Does it mean engineers can just be engineers, Chris?
I think it means they can spend more time on the things they love doing.
That's great. And how about you, Clive? What example have you brought to the table today?
The example that I brought, I'm glad you asked that question. The example I brought to the table is, I thought this is a rather nice example. This is an example of some work we've done with one of the police forces in the Middle East, where in the light bars on top of the police cars, we've built little TV cameras, 4 TV cameras, and some analytics capability so that as they drive the cars around the streets, it's doing automatic number plate recognition of all the cars that they drive past in the street, and it's storing all that information. So when they go, a car such and such was involved in a robbery, they can look through the data records and they can go, 2 hours ago it was spotted on such and such a street, 30 minutes ago it was driving down the motorway because one of our cars drove past it in the opposite direction. So using that analytical capability, looking at soft data, looking at unstructured data, and storing it away in a way that they can then access and use. They've made a number of significant arrests, shall we say, and taken crime off the streets.
Hopefully the right guys.
Hopefully the right guys.
Even better. So that's really good. So excellent. We're going to wrap up now. Leave our panel I'm going to ask you first, Dale, if you can. It's been a very interesting discussion. We've had lots of lessons all the way through, I think, so we haven't had to sort of have a barrage of lessons at the end. But if you could leave our listeners with one thought, that how to approach dealing with the vast quantities of data that you have today, what would it be?
I think it's just to stand back and say things have changed. I mean, there's technologies we've grown up with that have kind of moved forward. You know, if you're an Oracle guy, then you're used to Oracle adding features and functions, etc. in the core database. But actually, coming out of left field are some totally different ways of solving the same problems. And you've got step changes. A lot of people in the Valley talk about 10x uplift in return on investment and value and so on. And that's the way you should be thinking, not 1 or 2 times better, but 10, 100 times better. Whether it's faster, whether it's handling volumes or whatever. And the technologies are there. So you need to sort of stand back, learn about the different technologies. We mentioned graph databases, we've mentioned Hadoop, we've mentioned lots of things.
And grasp the opportunity.
That's it.
Clive?
Yeah,
Last thought.
My last thought is think about the APIs. Build something behind standard APIs, because those APIs will stand you in good stead as you go forward. They will be the the rock on the shoulders on which you stand to see further.
Excellent.
There you go.
Let me echo that.
And Chris?
Despite the challenge being 55 years minimum old, I think there's always new technologies and new practices that emerge, and particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, there have been some incredible ones that you can jump on now as any organisation and take advantage of. But make sure you understand what you're trying to do, make sure you think with scale in mind, and then you can realise these opportunities. The links that we've added here at the end, certainly from the IT perspective, we've got a number of examples that people can refer to, not just about our business, but how we've helped other customers with their particular use cases. So the audience may find something that resonates particularly with their audience in that space, but get on board.
Get on board.
And start.
I think that's a good note to leave it on. So get on board with the data-driven. It was a philosophical question, why are we here? We're here to get on board. So thank you very much for your time. Do tune in again. And if you've got any further follow-up questions, then give us a shout, including questions about digital marketing streams, which I didn't fully understand the question. So do let us know, and we'll come straight back to you. Thank you very much.